Good morning, great to see such a great roll-up, bloody fantastic. Now I've been given the brief of moving between lambs and beef cattle, so if you get confused at any stage, pull me up and make sure you understand which bit I'm referring to. Because I understand there's a lot of lambs and beef people here, so I want to cover both. We're going to work through drainage, the importance of pen surface, feed troughs or bunks, self-feeder bins and water troughs. Now, this might sound a bit dry, but it is extremely important to performance of stock in a feedlot, and the general principles can be seen in this aerial photo here. So we need an exclusion zone around the intensive feeding system so we can't have water flowing through the system. And it is contained through a series of drains from the pens, runs down into a sedimentation pond, and then the solids dropped out and the liquid goes into a retention pond, which can be a useful resource. So that's the general principle. Now, as far as lambs go, feed trough spacing, 5 centimetres per head or better. And my preference is certainly for a total mixed ration with feeding lambs. And we'll talk more about this when we go through the nutrition aspects, but it is always fraught with danger where you feed concentrates separate to roughage. It is a huge challenge for ruminal or lactic acidosis. So if you can feed a mixed ration, that is certainly preferable. Self-feeders, 3 centimetres per head. Water trough space, only 1 centimetre per head is required. But what's really critical here is that we have good high flow rates. And I would avoid large troughs. You want to keep the volume low so you can keep the water fresh, and clean. And with lambs, we clean those water troughs out every single day because they are such fussy, finicky buggers that they can't stand dirty water. I had one example of a client who had a trough near a working area and the dust used to accumulate on the surface, and he had trouble getting water consumption to target in that pen until he dangled some chains in, and the lambs would bump the chains to get that little bit of dust off the surface and then they'd drink. So they really are fussy. Feed and water troughs must not allow soiling, even though we're cleaning them every day. In lamb feedlots and beef feedlots, we would clean water troughs out 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times a week in summer, and certainly weekly in winter. Some people get worried about algae. They go, oh, look at this, there's algae in the trough, that's bloody terrible. That doesn't worry me. The algae, if anything, is probably doing us a favour by cleaning things up. It's just an indication of how long it is since the trough was cleaned. What worries me is that breaking down feed matter or faecal material particularly, and I'll show you a slide later that gives you an idea of the impact that faecal soiling can have on water intake and therefore on feed intake. Pen density, 1 to 5 square metres per head, depending on rainfall. If you're in a nice dry environment, obviously you can squeeze those lambs up a bit more. Here's a well-designed feedlot pen, great drainage and a solid structure, but you don't necessarily have to go the full hog on that sort of fence structure with lamb feedlotting, particularly when most of the time we're going to be moving in and out of lamb feedlotting anyway. I think it will generally always stay an opportunity business. And the reason for that is that grass-fed lamb is a magnificent product. There's no great advantage over grain-fed lamb because they're bloody good products to start with. The advantage of lot feeding lambs is just consistency and turnover and guaranteeing we can meet a spec at a given time. But when there's grass-fed lamb available, it's really difficult to compete with a grain-fed product. So we will always be moving in and out of it. And in that case, a good, solid ring lock fence, even with maxi posts, will do the trick. And the beauty of that is that it means we can move in and out of lot feeding lambs fairly easily because we don't have vast amounts of capital tied up in the facility like we do with beef feedlots. When it comes to feed troughs, I have problems with a design where lambs have to put their head into a dark box. We need to keep things open so that they can get in and see what they're eating, and they're skittish little buggers. They hate the idea that something might eat them while they've got their head in that dark place. So you won't get good consumption. Open troughs are a hell of a lot better. And people have said to me, well, You won't keep the buggers in. But it is amazing how few lambs get out of that system. So these are just smaller standard feedlot troughs. You could use these for cattle as well, with a bar at the right height. And if we're putting lambs in at 35 kilos plus, they're pretty big animals to start with, and it's actually fairly easy to manage. We lose very few with that system, as long as we feed them correctly in terms of feed delivery, which I'll talk about later. Water troughs, a great idea here was to minimise any soiling. It's a bit of a bugger to clean, but they designed a brush on a rope that you could pull through, so it wasn't too bad. My preference is for more open systems, so you can get in and clean it more quickly and more easily. Some people have taken that design and they've organised it so they can quickly detach the water line and just tip the whole lot, which makes it very quick and easy to clean. You've got to make these things quick and easy or they won't get done every day like they should. Cattle. Feed trough spacings, 22 centimetres per head. Now, if anyone's familiar with the guidelines, at least 22 centimetres per head. If anyone's familiar with the guidelines for feedlot design, that's well and truly below the suggested rates, which is 25 to 30, 30 to 38, and 38 to 46 centimetres for little cattle, yearlings and bullocks, respectively. The reason this works, because this is what you actually find in a lot of large commercial feedlots, is because of the way we feed the cattle. So we're not feeding them so that they all need to get in and get a feed at once. We're feeding them so that they are interested in feeding, but they're not pushing each other out of the way to get to a feed. So it's a very different approach. So this works in practice. Self-feeders, we require about 17 centimetres per head, and water trough space of 3 centimetres per head, which again, doesn't sound like much, but we've got to make sure we've got high flow delivery. Feed and water troughs, again, must not allow soiling. Pen density, 9 square metres per head is the minimum, the recommended minimum. So we want at least that. And again, it depends on how wet your site is. If you've got a well-drained, dry site, yeah, you can run up to those higher pen densities. And in fact, under dry, dusty conditions, it can be advantageous to actually stick a few more in the pen because you dampen down the surface with the urine and faeces. Works a treat. Okay, drainage. Extremely important. Why is drainage important? What sort of conditions could poor drainage lead to? I actually get to ask you questions too. I forgot to mention that at the start. Foot rot, absolutely. So lots of different forms of lameness, because if you cause maceration, breakdown of that skin between the claws, that gives access to a whole range of bugs that just occur naturally in faeces and on the pen floor. So you can end up with lameness problems. What else can it cause? Probably an unfair question. There's work from Texas A&M that shows you get for an average depth of mud on the pen surface of 15 centimetres, you get a 14% reduction in average daily gain with cattle. And then they went hell for leather, and for an average depth of 30 centimetres, you get a 25% reduction in average daily gain. And there's a corresponding increase in feed conversion ratio for those decreases in growth rate. So you increase problems with lameness and you decrease production. Really important. This is working well. They've just had a downpour because it's in southern Queensland and they get them. Gradient about 2.5 to 3%, and the water's run off really effectively and it's taken the solids out. This is actually working as it should. Drains, we generally run about 1.5%, so we get the water away without it cutting runs with erosion. There's our sedimentation pond with the retention weir here. Solids drop out, liquids into the retention pond, which can be used for irrigation. You just got to make sure that you're meeting your nutrient balances in terms of what EPA requires when you utilise that resource. Various flash ways of actually making those retention weirs, rock baskets look fantastic. They do actually fill up within about 5 minutes, but they look the part. I really like them. And wooden and throttle weirs here. Works well. And see, that's a relatively inexpensive system. That's cheap as chips to build. Okay, you have a resource there that you can use for irrigation. And the other thing is with pen cleaning, if you are routinely keeping cattle in a pen, there's not only a production driver and a health driver to ensure that we keep those pens clean, there's also a welfare aspect to that. So we are the custodians of the welfare of the cattle in our care. We must make absolutely sure that we are looking after their welfare to the best degree that we can. Not only because it's a PR issue, but also because it's the right thing to do. And the three things, health, production, and welfare go hand in hand. So we can do all those things for the benefit of us and the cattle. So with pen cleaning, we actually try to preserve an interface. So there's been a move away from that in some places, and in some instances it's not possible to clean the material off the pen without taking it back to the pen surface. And if that happens, that happens. But if you can leave that top 3 to 5 centimetres of compressed manure on it, then it acts as a layer between the gravel, the hard gravel, and the feed of the cattle, which is good in terms of not making them footsore. It's also less slippery. And if you put heavy cattle, if you have a pen clean and you transfer heavy cattle into a freshly cleaned pen with no interface, they'll be footsore within about 24 hours. So we need to look after that. Clean out under the fences, otherwise you end up making dams. One thing we can utilise, and this is particularly useful in mixed enterprises, because you've got machinery where you've got machinery constraints, but you've also got time constraints. If you're short of time to get in and clean pens, you can mound manure, and it gives you a short-term depot. When I say short-term, because cattle enjoy nothing more than demolishing those mounds. They put their mind to it and they say, great, we've got a project, we're going to demolish this as soon as we can. So they will only last, I don't know, a month or two, but they can be useful for short-term stockpiling so you can get around and get those pens mounded up and then remove the material later. The other thing is that during hot weather, you get them up into a bit more air movement, and that can be useful. And under wet conditions, provided it's not thoroughly wet, if that manure is likely to pack, it also gives you a way to get them up out of the mud. Now, if it gets super wet, like it did a couple of winters ago, hard to believe now, everything turns to pug. There's nothing you can do about that. You've just got to get the material out. Under those circumstances, we actually embarked on doing a fair amount more with bedding, and there's one site that's in a reasonably high winter rainfall area, southern area, where we routinely put out straw bedding now for all heavy cattle to begin with. Now they're doing it for the whole feedlot, including trade cattle. And you have to change that a few times through the winter, but it makes a huge difference to cattle comfort. And the main thing, the big payoff for the feedlot, is that with those big heavy cattle, we're not getting as many injuries where they slip, they bust things, and we're not getting as many cattle cast once that bed's down. Right. There's our interface layer, if anyone hasn't seen it. So it's compressed 3 to 5 centimetres, well looking after. We've got to make sure we don't keep making the same old mistakes. Now, what happens sometimes is that we do a bit of opportunity feedlotting and we go, right, well, we can see there's a quid in this, we're set up, we're equipped with plenty of feed, we're going to dive in and start feedlotting. Do it properly first up, because a lot of feedlots grow organically in a fairly bad way. Probably not so much now because of the huge amount of capital involved in building a beef feedlot, but it certainly can be the case with lamb feedlots. So if you are going to do it, refer to the guidelines, and there's a swag of wonderful published material for beef feedlots with the Designing Better Feedlots publication, which has recently been revised, and you can get that through MLA. And I understand departments of Ag, NLIS, have information on design of lamb feedlots. So refer to those documents. This is actually a feedlot in Canada, near Calgary, and when I say don't repeat mistakes, I'm showing my age a bit now. This is actually back in the 90s, so I don't know if they're still building them the same way. Will, have you been to Canada in the last couple of years? No. What amazed me was that they're still, they still look like that? Thank you. Okay, don't repeat mistakes. They're still putting feed bunks on the downhill end, having cattle walk through gullies basically to get to the feed. So that discourages intake. So simple things like that can have a big effect on performance and health. Notice these 10% porosity fences, something fortunately we don't have to worry about in Australia. Australia is a wonderful place to feed cattle. So we might struggle with a bit of heat through summer, but we're getting better at managing that. The reason they have 10% porosity fences is so that when the blizzards come through, the snow doesn't just eddy over and pile up and cover the fence and give them an escape route. So it slows down the wind, but if the snowfall is heavy enough, it has happened that they have had the fences basically covered, and cattle will stack up in the corner, poor buggers trying to stay warm. Then their mates go, "You beauty, we're out of here," and they just light out over the fence. That's why they have those fences. Feed troughs. A design that is easily cleaned is important, because something that's often missed, people get worried about botulism. They go, "Oh yeah, rotting animal matter." You can also get botulinum toxin produced from Clostridium botulinum overgrowth in decomposing vegetable matter as well. So if you've got troughs that are hard to clean out and you get little pockets of decomposing plant material, you can also end up with botulism from that. Something to be mindful of. If you're going to put an apron in, and I suggest you do, 3 metres is a good idea. If you make it too short, you simply move the trough in the pad a little bit further away from the feed trough. You don't have to be going all out with super duper designs like I just showed you, but whatever you do, however you design that feed trough, make sure that it has some integrity and won't allow feed to spill out. It amazes me how much people will tolerate of spilled feed. If you take something like a matter of 50, 100 grams per head per day, and in a large feedlot multiply that out over a year, it is a massive amount of feed. And feed is worth far too bloody much to be spilling it on the ground now. The feed conversion ratio from this stuff that's out here is appallingly low. It's almost as bad as the feed conversion ratio from that consumed by pigs. You got pigs around here? Yeah? Not so bad, yeah. I had a feedlot up in the Territory, and we used to have to hunt mobs of pigs out of the feed trough every morning. Plays havoc with your feed conversion. Simple things. Make sure that the design is appropriate to the size of the stock. These poor little buggers, they can't reach that feed there. So that's just a poor design. The other thing that I found really interesting in Canada, and again it was some years ago, I don't know if it's still the case, is the amount of wood that was used. Enormous amount of timber. But they've got lots of that. They don't call them Canucks for nothing. Okay, short apron, all you do is chop away the feed pad a little closer. Self-feeder bins, we mentioned 17 centimetres per head for cattle. Access is all important, and one of the key things about using self-feeders is to ensure that they never run out. So it's not the sort of thing you can say, "Oh, they're pretty close, they might get through until tomorrow, we'll fill them up tomorrow afternoon." If you make them hungry, they will engorge and you will cause lactic acidosis, because with self-feeder bins with cattle, where we can get some roughage through with them, and that roughage really needs to be at least 20, 25 mil. If it's any longer, it won't run through the feeder bin. It's not as prone to issues with acidosis as the lamb system with just pure grain, but if you run them out, you will cause a problem. The other issue with feeder bins is we tend to chop a trough around them, which fills up with mud, which can then cause lameness problems. So this is extremely well designed, but I would suggest if you're going to go to that sort of expense, then you're probably better off just to go all out and put in troughs. Water troughs, apron around them, make sure that they can't get in and defecate in them, but most cattle are gymnasts, so they will find a way to crap in those feed troughs. And every now and then, if they're feeling particularly nasty, and they know that the stocky cleaning the water troughs has had a big Sunday night the night before, they'll throw up in the water. And that fermenting mess is something to behold, like the stocky. Right, water intake. We mentioned previously how dramatically important this is to performance, and water intake relates directly to feed intake and therefore to performance. So if you restrict water intake, you restrict feed intake, therefore you slow down growth rate, increase feed conversion ratio. Quite fundamental stuff. I found this one interesting. We're looking at cool water, hot water, and British and Bos Indicus cattle. The Brahmins didn't give a bugger. In fact, there's a non-significant increase in daily gain. So I think they like to drink tea. It must be an Indian thing. Whereas the British cattle, no, it knocked them around. They like cool water. So if you have a structure where you have exposed pipes, get them buried, quick smart. It's having an adverse effect. manure contamination, I worked out that this, where we got a reduction in feed intake, it was akin to something like a tablespoonful of manure per litre of water. It's a tiny amount. So if you look at a feed trough, and sometimes you might see, you know, a big lump of faeces at one end, that is certainly enough to decrease water intake. That is why it's so critically important that we clean them out regularly. If you see that when you're doing the pen check, you don't say, geez, we need to clean those water troughs. Clean the bloody thing out there and then. That's a North American water trough. Again, it's a problem we don't encounter here. This was actually in Colorado, and the balls are there so they can push on them to break the ice so they can then get in and get a drink. That's got to be a bugger of a way to get a drink, hasn't it? And that's the same feedlot. They thought they'd get in early. Because you know how often people will go and build near a feedlot and then start complaining. Well, they put their sign up and said, just realise there are going to be some issues with this for you. Right, induction procedures. Now, this is where I ask you. It's hard with a big crowd, but I will get you going. What do we do at induction with cattle? What are we giving them for a new car? Do you just put them in the feedlot and say, good luck, chaps? Vaccination? Absolutely. So what are you vaccinating against?
Just your normal, well, I'm not quite sure of the cattle with the lambs anyway, but the cattle I'd say you're 6 or 7 in one.
Yeah, fair enough. So the clostridial vaccine?
Probably a drench maybe.
A drench? Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. What sort of drench do we need? A long-lasting drench? Do we need an expensive drench? Are they likely to become infected with parasites while they're on the feedlot? No, no bloody chance. So all you need is a drench that's going to knock down all the major species. Now in the south, we have to ensure that we also take out inhibited osteotargia. So it's either a generic ML, you know, an abamectin, or an oxfendazole. Cheap as chips. So you don't need to spend a heap of money on flash drenches when they're going straight into the feedlot. Same thing applies with lambs, as long as you are knocking everything out. The clostridial vaccination, just be aware that those killed vaccines can suppress growth rate for 3 or 4 weeks after they're given. And there's quite a bit of data to support that. So if it's possible with an on-farm system to actually give that clostridial vaccine 2 or 3 weeks before they come in, do that if you can, because it will slow them down a little. So, but I'm not game enough not to give them a clostridial vaccination going into the feedlot. Because any situation where you have a high intake of readily fermentable carbohydrate and some of that can overflow from the rumen through into the intestine, and that's certainly what we've got with feedlot diets, then you can get overgrowth of Clostridium perfringens and the elaboration of that toxin. So it is cheap insurance, but we just got to manage it so that we don't knock early performance around if we can. What else do we give them? Okay, so with lambs, ideally they're already accustomed to eating concentrates because you've creep fed them or you've trail fed them at some stage, so they're accustomed to the grain. If you can do it, absolutely, couldn't agree more. Weighing was mentioned here, absolutely critical. It just amazes me how long cattle on pasture particularly go without being weighed. So we try to do a 6-week reweigh. I've got a cattle place that I try to run on the weekends for my sins. It's a genetic fault. I couldn't get away from it. So we weigh them every 6 weeks, roughly. And that has allowed us to pick up changes in seasonal feed availability, which is not much to talk about at the moment, but changes in seasonal feed availability and quality that we never would have picked up otherwise. So get some weights on them. We need some data. We need to know how we're performing. So you need to be able to say to your nutritionist or your vet, these bloody cattle aren't growing fast enough. What are you doing? You've got to have the information. Couldn't agree more. What else do we do? We've covered most of it. Okay, identification, we didn't mention. So we have the NLIS in cattle, so that's a given. Use that information. This is one of the greatest tools that we have available for improving our productivity because we can measure stuff now that we never could before. What I find bizarre is that I see producers every now and then going, oh, I've got to sell those cattle, I'll whack an NLIS tag in them. You've got the cost without the return. use that tag, and if you've got an antenna, a reader on a weighing box, bang, 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 you can run them through QuickSmart. It's a wonderful tool. So use that stuff. But we also put a visual tag in. Why? Why do we bother with a visual tag? Obviously, in case we lose an NLIS tag, which then allows us to match up to what its original ID was, but also it gives us ready identification when we're looking to identify sick cattle and treatments, and we can record our treatments either on that tag or on an additional treatment tag. We've got to be able to track that information to ensure the integrity of our withholding periods. Now, when it comes to lambs, and I think this is a bit of a hot topic, I would say if you are routinely feedlotting lambs, if you're doing that for several months of each year, I would certainly use electronic IDs in a sample so that you could track performance more rapidly and easily. And in fact, if possible, I'd like to see the whole lot with electronic IDs in, because that gives you an enormous amount of information and quick information when it comes to your reweighs. So I know some people are not happy with it, and it certainly is a substantial expense when you look at the value of sheep, but the value of sheep is rapidly chasing the value of cattle at the moment, so it's not such a disparity. Okay, flukicide. If you're buying cattle from anywhere where fluke are known to occur, hit them with a flukicide on the way in. And the only drench that takes out all stages of fluke is triclobendazole, so immatures and matures. Now, the area where fluke can occur has actually expanded considerably since the big La Niña years. And you also need to be wary of the potential for fluke to actually exist and be transmitted down irrigation channels. So I'm not sure, it's something to talk to the LLS people about, I'm not sure exactly where that boundary is anymore because fluke have spread considerably. Clostridial vaccination was mentioned, so that's a 5-in-1 or your 7-in-1. 7-in-1 you mentioned, lepto as well, with cattle. Don't know, yeah, but you're going well, just keep bluffing. So lepto as well, that's highly unlikely to have a production effect in the feedlot. And a lot of the lesions we see at the abattoir are old lesions in kidneys, so it's lepto that they might have suffered as a calf, which can leave those spots on the kidneys, which has an effect on them when they're little, but it's unlikely to affect the cattle in the feedlot. The big issue there is OH&S. And I've heard of people who had lepto, and it's a horrendous disease. So if you care about your staff, it's probably worth doing. Respiratory vaccines in cattle. So we recently just finished a big study funded by MLA and was supported by Coopers as well, where we looked at various vaccine combinations in cattle that were locally backgrounded. So we dragged cattle from all over the place, sale yards everywhere, multiple sites throughout Australia, including WA, and we found that where we put them in local backgrounding, so I mean you can walk them out of that backgrounding system into the feedlot, where we had them there for at least 4 weeks, it didn't pay to vaccinate them. Where there was an issue with IBR, it certainly paid to use a vaccine against IBR, whether that was Bovillus MH plus IBR or Rhinogard. So those were worth doing if you identified IBR. So the use of a vaccine against Mannheimia hemolytica, which is the MH bit in Bovillus MH, depends on the timing of feedlot entry and the prior history of the cattle. If you're in a system where you can only put them out in the paddock for a couple of weeks, then it's still worth giving them a Bovillus MH or Bovillus MH plus IBR, because they don't have time to get over all the stresses and inflammation involved with going through sale yards and transport and swapping those respiratory viruses. We know that from the National BRD initiative, if you only give them a couple of weeks, you actually have an increased risk of BRD. So if you're going to use backgrounding, make it 4 weeks, make it next door, you can save your money on the vaccination. Less than that, I suggest you vaccinate. And particularly if you're buying cattle direct from the property of origin, if you're getting farm of origin cattle, I'd have them vaccinated, because those poor buggers are most likely naive to pretty much every virus known to man, because they haven't had that mixing. So the mixing is to the detriment of the cattle in the short term, but it makes them more immunologically robust in the long term. But if you're buying cattle straight out of the paddock from the neighbour, work with your neighbour to have them vaccinated before they come to your place. So on MH plus IBR, we have a vaccination interval of 2 weeks now. So if you can only hold them for a couple of weeks, you can use that vaccine, or, losing my voice, or you can get the producer to actually give them the first vaccine and you give them the next one on the way in. HGP in cattle, unless you have a market that doesn't want to take HGPs, that won't accept HGPs, you are crazy not to use these. There is absolutely no human health risk whatsoever. It is purely a political issue. There's no reason we shouldn't be using these. If you have a market that says, no, we won't take them, and you're tailoring to that market, okay, don't use them, but you're losing out. There's a great return on investment from the use of HGPs. Shearing in lambs, lots of data either way, to the extent that I don't know whether it has a positive effect or not. And I would say the data is so equivocal, I would say don't spend the money on shearing them unless the skin value is such that you're picking up a premium for that 6 week shorn skin. In that case, it's probably worth doing. But otherwise, it's just an expense. Okay. There's a few procedures, and I'm glad they didn't come up. There's a few procedures that are done with cattle and sometimes with sheep on induction that have absolutely no supporting evidence. In fact, we know they don't work. We've established that well and truly, but they die a very slow death. Vitamin A, D and E doesn't actually have an effect. B vitamins demonstrated not to have an effect. Microbial inoculants have not been shown to have an effect. I'll show you why. So we had about 4,000 head through this study back in 2008, and to look at this was cattle, to look at the effect of injectable vitamin A, D and E on entry, on subsequent health and production. And I said to myself, look, it's got to be the vitamin E that's having the big effect. If they've got adequate vitamin A, that's not too much of a worry. They don't need vitamin D because this was Queensland and they're getting plenty of sunlight. So I did a high E, low A mix. Then I did the vitamin A, D and E at labelled dose, twice labelled dose, and the placebo carriers at those doses. And the only thing we achieved was to end up with more non-eaters with Paul's Super Brew of the high vitamin E. So nothing else changed. I suspect that we made them sore. So any time we jab a needle into something, we need to be bloody sure that we're actually going to have a positive effect, because we could have a negative effect. Hippocrates said, above all else, do no harm. We need to establish we're not going to do harm first and foremost. So save your money. But there's more. Big study here. This is a meta-analysis. So if you go home tonight and people say, what do you learn? You can say, I know all about meta-analysis. It's a piece of cake. It's a statistical tool that's just dead easy. So what it allows you to do is to take a number of studies, and the size of the box here describes the sample size and how much variance there was in the results. This line here is nil effect. So we're looking at morbidity, so whether or not they became sick here, and above 1 means that there's an increased chance of them becoming sick, below 1's a decreased chance of them becoming sick. So a lot of people had said, oh, based on this study, injectable vitamin E decreases the chances of cattle becoming sick in the feedlot. Have a look at the overall result. It's on the wrong side of the 1. Fortunately, it's not significant, but there's the potential that we could be doing harm. So it doesn't work. There's still more from the National BRD Initiative, Bovine Respiratory Disease Initiative, a big epidemiological study in 2014. We found an odds ratio of 1.1. So more than 1 means you increase the risk, but it wasn't significant. So we can confidently say this does not work. So you save your money on the AD&E. I did have a bit of frustration with a client many years ago who said, oh, but it doesn't cost much. I said, well, geez, stop screwing with the wall on a price of a bottle of Mycotil and stop spending money on AD&E. I'll take that money. There's a new take on fox hunting. So it's B12, I think, is the nice pink stuff they put in those vaccines. It's a relatively small amount. If you have a healthy rumen, the rumen microbes produce all the B vitamins the animal requires. And unless you're off cobalt deficient country, giving B12 is not going to make any difference. So with a lot of these things, once you saturate all the potential sites for that vitamin or that mineral to be involved in enzymes in the body, all you do is then produce expensive urine. So it doesn't make any difference, no. But if you're in cobalt deficient country, it's something you need to look at. And cobalt deficient country is parts of the tablelands. It's mostly coastal sandy soils. You gave the vitamin AD injection in the leg, and it caused a lot of lameness. Yeah, which doesn't surprise me because a lot of these things are fairly irritant. So we are causing some irritation. So we have to do it. We have to have justification for doing it. And I make the point too that the cattle in that study, and certainly my study, and I would imagine in pretty much all the other feedlots where those other studies were done, you had a very good vitamin, mineral, trace element premix that was going into the feed. So they were being fed the stuff in any event. So we're covering their requirements with the premix. But that's an important point, thank you. Okay, what's it cost currently for a worm egg count?
Your base one's about $40, but we go for around that 90 because we do the Fluke and Coccidia and all that.
Okay, so $90, worms, Fluke, Coccidia. Oh, I think that's going to be really hard to manage to get your results back quickly enough to determine whether or not you use a drench at feedlot entry. So my practical 24 hours? You can hold them in a quarantine area, then you may be able to save yourself a quid on some drenching. So if they're coming in pretty clean, there's no point giving them a drench. We only do this based on averages. So if you can get 24 turnaround, yeah, I think that's worth looking at, yeah. Now, more generally, that's going to be fairly site specific, so I'm going to refer to your NLIS vets for an answer on that one. Frequency of worm egg count checks in irrigation country. 4 to 6 weeks under high challenge. It's got to be related to your environment. So if you're in dry country through summer, after your summer drench, you're probably going to be safe until the break in the season. But if you've got irrigated country, you've basically got a constant high risk. Yeah, so that's more like 6 weeks. What frequency do you use? So the answer was we're testing every 3 to 4 months, but the last couple of tests have been quite low. So the management systems that have been put in place have managed to keep that worm burden quite low. So it's working. Information is power. That's great.
There's a lot to choose from. You go to a shop and
there are
thousands.
I think when it comes to sorting through all those products, you're best off to get independent advice, because then you've got some. Then you've got someone, and I do sell premixes and so on as well, but
Anything with ALPS on it.
yeah, ALPS is good. No, then you've got someone whose sole purpose is not to sell you the product. So if you've got an independent nutritionist and you can say to them, what about this product? They might say, well, there's this other one here which is going to have the same or higher concentrations of the goodies and it's actually less money. So that's what it comes down to. There are some pretty big markups on a lot of the off-the-shelf products. So see if you can get someone to give you a bit of comparison, a bit of advice. They are worth using where, unless you're just topping stock off for 2 or 3 weeks, I think you really need to take care of those vitamin and trace element requirements. And if you're going to do that, it's well and truly worth using a rumour modifier. So it might be Rumensin in cattle or Bobatec in lambs, because that's money for jam. We know we get a good return on those. So the short answer is yes, use them for any sort of substantial feeding period. Try to get some independent advice on what's best for you. Okay, question is, what do you do to reduce shy feeders? What do you do if you get a few of them? Yeah, it's a tricky one. I haven't seen data on it, but I certainly agree that if lambs already know to eat grain from prior exposure, I think it's easy to get them feeding. And I think the same applies to cattle, where we yard wean. You teach them to actually eat concentrates out of a bunk. It's easy to get them feeding when they come in. So those behavioural effects, I think, are very important. Where we get into strife with big licks, big numbers of lambs in large feedlots where we're dragging them out of sale yards from various sources, is time off feed, and that can induce a failure for them to eat. Because if you if you reduce the microbial population in the rumen enough, and you're not only doing that with time off feed, you're actually also reducing the metabolic activity of the papillae in the lining of the rumen to absorb those fermentation products. That suppresses intake. So the single most important thing is to get these buggers eating early, quickly. Once you get blood glucose up, you overcome the appetite suppressant effect of tissue mobilisation. How you do that is the tricky bit. There are feeds that have a really strong smell and are really palatable that might help with troublesome pens to get them on the feed. Lucerne hay appears to work very well. I think legume hay generally. So if you just do a chop run and just get them eating first and foremost. That's more important than getting them on the big licks of grain straight away. You've got to get them eating first. So I would suggest legume hay, and perhaps with a problem pen, splitting them, giving them more access to the trough. And you might spend a bit of time just very quietly pushing them up and holding them on the buck, just seeing if you can get the buggers to actually take to the feed. With cattle, if you have cattle coming off the truck that are obviously knocked around and they don't eat, they might just need a rest for the first 24 hours or so because they just get tired. They're still not eating and they've had a prolonged period off feed. So it could be 3-5 days by the time they've been mustered, put through yards, transported. You can get that situation that I was talking about where mobilisation of tissue and fat bodies in their bloodstream suppresses appetite. If you kick their blood sugar up, they'll start eating. So those individual cases where you go, I've got 5 here, they just won't eat, stick a bag of 4-in-1 into them, a calcium, magnesium, borogluconate. It kicks up their blood sugar. It takes care of the fact that they will undoubtedly be low in calcium and magnesium, and the higher blood sugar might seem odd, but it overrides the effects of those fat bodies, and they feel better and they start eating. So that's a few things you can consider. So there's a heap of work with the intensive feeding of lambs that's yet to be done. So often we find ourselves extrapolating from cattle, but we don't really know. So I suspect it will help, but is there anyone from MLA here? We can get some funding, we'll do the study. Works, you reckon? You've observed. So Emily has said trail feeding, even if you're holding stock in a paddock before you put them into the feedlot, even a week before, running a bit of grain out in a trail to get them used to eating it, has been observed to have a positive effect, and it makes sense to me. That makes sense. Adequate vitamin A status will help. So if they're getting adequate vitamin A in their feed, it won't make any difference to inject them with extra because it won't actually overcome the infection with the organism that's causing the pink eye. But vitamin A is important to the integrity of all the surfaces on the body, including the conjunctiva around the eye. So make sure that is being covered in your premix would be my suggestion. So injections aren't going to make any immediate difference. And every time I say that, there's someone who says, yeah, we had 50 and we gave it to them and they came good. Well, they're probably going to come good anyway. So we've got to be a little bit careful about cause and effect. Okay, so the question is confinement in itself an advantage to production? You're better off, if you're going to use self-feeders, should you just put them out in the paddock, or do you get an advantage from putting them in a pen? And the short answer is you get an advantage from putting them in the pen because you reduce the energy they burn up in walking around. So the silly buggers won't just camp near the feeder bin and go, I can get everything I need there. They do still tend to do quite a lot of walking. So that's mainly where the production advantage comes from. It also gives you better control over what they're actually eating. So out in the paddock, they still get a bit of feed here, a bit of feed there. And from what I've seen, you're more likely to end up with more variation in a group of lambs because some are eating the feed, some are not. So there's a couple of advantages to confinement. Yep. Yeah.
What's the minimum weight range for lambs and
The question is what's the minimum weight range for lambs to go into a feedlot? If you're feeling really hard on yourself, you can wean them early and put them in at 15 kilos. I've heard of down to 12.5. That is a bit of a suicide mission. You're right to shake your head. You do lose quite a few of those. They are looking for an excuse to die. The merino weaner's sole purpose in life is to find a way to die, as you all know. So ideally, I'd like to see them go in about 35 kilos. That makes my life a hell of a lot easier. And yours. Oh, pelleted. Okay, so powdered versus pelleted. It depends on your system. If you've got a really dry ration, then the concern is that powdered premixes can get lost out of the system and you end up shoveling it out of the trough or the trough on the feeder bin. As long as the pellets are palatable, they can work better in that system. But you just got to make sure that you make a pellet that they're going to be happy to eat. And with a concentrate-only automated system that I've worked with over the last few years, we ended up specially formulating a concentrate pellet, so it was 50 kilos per tonne inclusion, and we added in molasses and Aptozyme and another palatability enhancer, and we had to chop the pellet length to the same length as the barley grains, and we made sure that the lupins was milled and was the same size as the barley grains, and then we got good even intake. So depends on your system. You put me in a difficult position, I think. But so Bovatec is a registered ionophore, so there's no problem with feeding it. Whatever that rumen enhancer is, I'd have to know what it was before I could comment. But if it's an antibiotic, you need to be sure of what you're actually dealing with. Yeah, you need to know what you're feeding. Yeah. As in the person you're dealing with needs to tell you exactly what's in it. Yeah. I think we're out of time. Where's my chairperson? Do you, time for one quick one? Shade. Right. I'll mention shade and then I'll get your question. You're not meant to ask me questions. You're just adding to the load. Shade, I'll come back to you. Shade has been, shade's a tricky thing. So in cattle, if you have short-fed cattle and during the finishing period, some shaded, some not shaded, if the timing of turn-off is such that those unshaded cattle after a heat event have got a few weeks to catch up, they tend to compensate. So it's not that you will consistently make a return from it. However, if the heat period coincides with the period towards the end of feeding, shade will make a big difference. The other thing is it reduces the number of deaths under excessive heat load. So it's a bit of an all or nothing event. You don't get the big payback until you get into real strife, really bad conditions. There is no doubt that particularly with British breed cattle, if you have shade in what is generally a dry climate, you will significantly reduce deaths under conditions of excessive heat load. And depending on the timing of turn-off, you will often also get a production payoff as well. Right, and as far as lambs go, again, we need to do more work. Sheep handle heat better because of their fleece. There's work from Broken Hill that showed that the outside of the fleece of merino sheep in summer got to 70 odd degrees and they maintain normal body temperature. So if they've got a bit of fleece on them, they're a hell of a lot better at handling the heat, but I don't know, there might be an advantage. We need to do that work. It's certainly from a welfare perspective, or maybe that's just being anthropomorphic. I prefer if there's shade there, but we don't really know. I said I'd come back to someone here, yeah. So the question was, how short can you make that interval on Clostridial revaccination, for the booster? You can come back to 4 weeks. I'm not sure how far you can stretch it out. I'm not sure that work's been done. Shepherd's hook, here in a minute.